Good day. I'm John Daniel, the President of the Commonwealth of Learning, and I'm here with Glennie, who is the Executive Director of the South African Institute for Distance Education, which does many wonderful things in the area of distance education, not the least of which is being the driving force behind OER Africa, Open Educational Resources Africa. So Jenny, tell us about OER Africa, what it does, what it is, who it's for.
Sadie has always thought that learning materials were enormously important for students, particularly in the ODL context, but also in the face-to-face context. In the ODL context, students spend, as you know, a huge proportion of their time interacting with learning materials, and so the quality of those learning materials is essential. Very often, though, educators take very little time in developing those resources, and often the students have very little access to those resources, particularly in the African context. We come across occasions over and over again where students have prescribed books, and actually they're never able to access those books in the context in which they are. So the notion of open education resources was one that was enormously exciting to us. We are aware across the world of some excellent educational resources that have become available and are now openly available. So let's just say, I'm sure you understand what open education resources are, but they are resources which are free for people to use without having to pay any accompanying license or royalty.
And do they have to use them as is, or?
No, they definitely don't. They can certainly adapt them. Very often the license under which you then release them again would say that you can adapt them, and then how you've adapted it, you must then in turn make freely available to everybody.
So you're building a pool of things all the time.
Building a pool more and more. And so that's under the Creative Commons license. If one turns to the ODL context, I think it's important to remember that although the materials are at the center of the learning experience, that very often institutions, with some notable exceptions, don't actually give the academics sufficient time in which to design those materials. And for example, we did a study in South Africa where we did 20 case studies, and we found that educators were only given between 1 to 2 hours in order to design materials for one notional learning hour. Now, this is clearly not enough.
Yes, I mean, I've heard figures like 30 if you want to do
well.
Well,
30, 100, 200. I think the British Open University certainly works around the 100.
Yeah.
So what you're finding is that courses are fairly thrown together. Now, what we've been trying to encourage through OER Africa is that, for example, in an ODL context, what you would be doing would, when you begin, you would be saying, well, what are the resources that are out there? Let us go and find them first, and then see those which we believe are good, and let's utilize them.
So OERs is not just about making them, but about using them and taking advantage of those that exist.
Exactly, and then taking them back into, so that, as you say, the pool gets bigger and bigger. I think that's important to remember that for the educator, this is not the panacea, and I think one's got to be quite worried about that. Sometimes educators think, well, all I need to do is go onto the web and find something, and then you know, I have created my lesson for tomorrow or my course for the students. The curriculum design notion has to be there for the educator. It's still the educator's job to say, A, what are the needs of my students? B, what am I looking for as exit level outcomes? C, how am I going to assess them and ensure that it matches? How am I going to support them? Now, the OERs will not do that. So although OERs are a very exciting notion, they really must not be seen as a kind of panacea for the ills of education.
Yeah, I mean, just calling it an OER doesn't actually improve on what you've done. Yeah.
No,
yeah.
But it is very important for the educator to keep his or her role is central to this process of designing the learning experience for the students. I think it's also important for educators to be continuing to be critical of what OERs are that are out there, and the hallmarks that we have, particularly in the ODL environment over the years, look to of quality must be uppermost in our minds. And just as we know when we go onto Google, that we can find all sorts of rubbish information. Similarly, when you go on to look for an OER, you can find some very bad open education resources. And so one has to have one's critical faculties very present in trying to identify whether they are actually fit for your purpose in constructing.
And one of the worries I know about OERs is that it would be a unidirectional neo-colonialist north to south thing. Well, the fact you're already doing it in this Africa is itself interesting, and presumably these OERs are moving at least within Africa. And are there cases where they're going outside Africa? In other words, it's a south to north use of OERs.
And that was one of the very strong motivations for OER Africa, was that we were seeing all of these initiatives in other parts of the world, starting with MIT, the Open University, a number of other universities. And it was very often those institutions saying, well, we'll put our materials out online, and then we assume that you, the consumers, will be using them. So if a network is to be successful, it needs to be inclusive and to ensure that as many people as possible can participate in it, and particularly in the developing context. So our task is threefold. On the first, we are saying to academics, to teachers, if you're developing resources, make them available to other people. And then continue to look for other people's resources that you can use, see if you can put your resources and theirs together in the curriculum process that I have identified, and then make those available in turn. And we certainly now have had examples of various different kinds. In some cases, it's been of developing a whole course in a collaborative way, and then almost all of those people have come from different institutions, and then they have gone back and used those courses in their institutions. We are hoping very much that the African Council on Distance Education will be starting to develop, adopt that model, so that a course that is available from one open university can be used in another university without having to develop from scratch. Obviously, there's an issue of adaptation for the local context.
So it probably helps in a circumstance like that if someone from the receiving university has some contact with the developing team as it's going on, so they feel a bit of ownership.
Yes, absolutely.
Although that's not always easy to organise.
No, and obviously, you know, in the beginning there might be a group, 20 people who've been involved in the development, but one hopes that many more people are going to be using it. But certainly our understanding and our experience has been that if people are involved in the development, then they are much more likely to use it. But I think if the way of working starts to change, where people start to say, well, it is easy to find a good resource and to make use of it, and particularly in some cases if it's a small resource, it's not the whole course that you have to adopt. So we've certainly found some examples. We have in the University of Malawi, for example, put together a course which was around midwifery, and we were supported by University of Michigan, and they made all sorts of resources available. Obviously, they had to be adapted for the Malawian context. You couldn't have a high-tech Michigan hospital and put it into the Malawian environment, so we took all sorts of video clips within Malawi. But we were able then to piece together a course. This was for a face-to-face, not for an open and distance learning program. Piece together a course which had a range of different video clips, examples of text or texts where one had the theory expounded, interviews with people, etc. And then to make sure that we had a learning pathway through those for the students. So now those people who've been involved in this experience suddenly think differently about how they would design a course in the future. What they did then, although the result of what they did is now become available on OER Africa as a resource that could be used elsewhere.
And the folks in Michigan are at least looking at it, if not actively using it, perhaps.
Yes, well, in many universities, people are often trained not only for public health, for example, in their own countries, but also for public health in other countries. And so one can see that possibility. To date, I can't say that we've had examples of it being used in another country.
Yeah. No, that squares very much. I don't know if you want to ask me about some of the things we're doing at Commonwealth of Learning.
Yes, indeed.
Well, I think there are three areas where, first of all, Commonwealth of Learning has made a big commitment to this, because right from the start 20 years ago, one of our tasks was to share materials around the Commonwealth. It was set up because if you can't move the students, move the courses. So OERs are really a terrific gift to us. And I suppose our first real involvement, we were only bit players and you were bigger players, and that was the Tessa program, which involves African universities, and I'm sure OER Africa is in there somewhere.
Yes, we are. We now actually have a joint project between Tessa and Sadie in a distance education, in a teacher education network that is at its early stages of development.
And just so that people who are listening to us understand, Tessa stands for Teacher Education in Sub-Saharan Africa, and is a huge corpus of open educational resources for teacher education, very much with a focus on the classroom, which is available, I think, in Arabic, English, French, and Kiswahili. So that sort of got us into it. The two projects that are more, if you like, indigenous to COL are, first of all, the Virtual University for Small States of the Commonwealth, which, if ever there was a multi-directional project, this is it, because up to 32 countries are involved in jointly developing learning materials as OERs and then adapting them for their own use. It's been a long learning process. And when I look back on the first workshop in 2006, where we developed the first course with a group coming together in Mauritius on ecotourism, the recent one 4 years later in the Maldives was so much more productive. We got better at it, but partly also because people are getting more and more IT skills as we go along.
Yes. And I think your other experience of the OER materials developing for open schools also indicates that this takes a lot longer than you think it's going to take.
Yeah, well, I was going to mention that because I know that Sadie is involved and has played a very, very useful role in doing some fairly hard-nosed evaluation of that project. Again, just for the information of those watching, this is a project involving 6 countries. Trinidad and Tobago is the only one that's not in Africa, and the others are Seychelles, Lesotho, Botswana, Namibia, and Zambia. And what they've done is to divvy up the last 2 years of the secondary curriculum, and each country works on part of it, so that by the end you've got, I think, 20 different courses, and they can be mixed and matched and used and everything. But as you say, it's not been straightforward. But maybe we could talk a bit about what are the pitfalls of developing these things.
Well, I think we would all be agreed that it's really important to put very high quality OERs up. If you're going to make materials available to the world, they better be good. And in some cases, I think that it was difficult for the participants to have the time available to spend on actually producing the materials. In some cases, people didn't actually have the skills of developing materials for independent learners. And so those of us who've been involved in ODL for a long time know that that's not necessarily an easy skill and does take time to develop and also needs a lot of support in order to ensure that those skills are developed until such time as people are able. It's often 3-4 months of work before you're able actually to produce, and you need to be a good teacher.
Yeah,
to begin
I
with.
mean, we feel that in this 6-country project, one of the most important legacies, in fact, is 100 master teachers who were probably already good teachers. In fact, I'm sure they were. But they now have this new skill, which we hope will permeate the system, and they'll train others and so on and so forth.
So I think one has to remember that developing materials for an OER context is much, much more difficult than developing materials for a face-to-face context. So we have a couple of projects working in OER health and in OER agriculture, where these are resources that can be used in a face-to-face classroom. Often, though, now in contexts where there are huge numbers of students, so the resources become more and more important. So we've had in Africa the notion of massification of higher education, which has meant that lots more students come, but the number of academics has not increased at all.
Yeah.
And so the classes can be 1,000, 2,000. So the importance of the resources grows. And it's been much easier in a way there to start to develop useful materials because you can have much shorter. You could have a very nice activity, for example, or a demonstration of some kind, all of which can be inserted into the classroom and making for a much better learning environment than one would otherwise have.
Because presumably when we talk about OERs, they're nearly always developed on a sort of digital framework, but they may well not be used as e-learning materials.
Yes, we certainly have had examples. For example, in the University of Malawi, when I spoke about that nursing program, the students were not going to have access either to the internet, so it certainly could not be online. But they did have access to computers, and so we were able to put the resources onto a CD-ROM, and then students could use those. But in other cases, we've taken the digital resource and printed it. You know, as always, there's the lesson that distance educators have is that you must use the technology that students have access to, and you must use it for the purpose for which it is best suited. And that's what
one of the things we found in this 6-country project was that they were so excited about the idea of e-learning that they wanted to get into doing that or converting it to e-learning before they'd really finished the print. And I think we learnt the hard way. Get a good print version, properly designed, and then transforming it is very easy. And the same thing with the multimedia.
And especially in those countries where internet access is by no means ubiquitous at the moment, and sometimes where it is available, it's still enormously expensive. And so you can't be online for very large amounts of time. So you can't use all the knobs and whistles that are available to other people, but nevertheless you can produce excellent materials.
So we're coming to the end of our time. I mean, would you say OERs are definitely not a flash in the pan? I mean, this is not just another educational technology fad?
Well, I think that OERs have got a really important role to play. I think one's got to be very careful not to see them as a panacea.
Yeah.
And I think part of the problem is many of the zealots in OER have put forward that this is going to be solving the world's educational problems and making everybody educated and everybody have access. It doesn't work like that. I think I think that OER will be used by a number of people. Whether it can become a sustainable movement, I think, is the jury is still out, because that would actually require that a critical mass of people have got into this cycle of developing their own materials, making them available to other people, using other people's materials, putting those together, making something more available. So if one imagined a system in which everybody was doing this, it can, over 10, 20, 30 years, become a sustainable exercise, because it would mean that all of us as educators would be doing things somewhat differently from the way in which we were doing them before.
Well, thank you, Jenny. So there it is. We hope that this has taught you something about open educational resources. As Jenny has just said, they're not a panacea. This is just one more tool in the toolkit of those who use technology in education, but we think it has a lot to contribute to the expansion of education and the improvement of educational quality.